the Asia-Pacific Business Forum podcast, exploring business, policy, and personalities across the Pacific region.
Hello, my name is Dick Drovnik. I'm the host of the Asia-Pacific Business Forum podcast. And today I have the great pleasure of having a conversation with my friend Peter Drysdale. Peter is the Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Australian National University, and he's been a leading figure in the economic integration of Asia-Pacific economies. In fact, Peter is widely recognized as the leading intellectual architect of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, which will be meeting in a few days, the annual meeting of its leaders in Korea. And we've had this remarkable set of leaders meetings in Kuala Lumpur at the last few days, where the Association of Southeast Asian Nations leaders have met, and the East Asian Forum leaders have met, and the RCEP leaders, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership leaders have met. And so, Peter, welcome to this podcast, and tell me something about how you think these leadership meetings are going and how countries might adjust to this American-led, threat-based, unpredictable trade environment coming from a predictable, rules-based trade environment.
Well, it's good to speak with you, Dick. And it's pretty interesting times, I must say. One would be foolish to try to predict where everybody will land at the end of this process. But I think what we've seen in Southeast Asia over the past few days, where we've had the East Asian summits going on there around the ASEAN process, is a struggle between two conceptions of the world that are important to this part of the world in particular. One of them, the rules-based system, which has sustained the growth of economic interdependence and the prosperity, the success stories of East Asian growth over the last several decades, and a system which Trump is trying to frame around the exercise of American, in trade terms, coercive power, and negotiate on a bilateral basis deals with every major partner, trading partner of the United States. And that was in full play in Kuala Lumpur this week. We had the ASEANs, having earlier been alerted to the threat to their economic interests on Liberation Day, institute what was called a geoeconomics task force to report on strategies to defend against the Trump Liberation Day tariffs and work a way through it. Of course, all the individual ASEAN countries went off to Washington negotiating bilateral deals where they could to alleviate the really quite high tariffs that Trump had imposed upon the Southeast Asian countries. Quite high tariffs, to some extent inexplicably high when one considers the critical role that these economies play as swing states politically and economically in the Asian region. But there they were. And in various ways, they've been negotiating that process up to this time. And those negotiations are still going on, although in Kuala Lumpur, a couple of them had deals signed, Malaysia in particular and Cambodia, which look pretty strange when you look at them. They give away an awful amount to the United States for very little in return.
Did the regional task force, which I think Mari Pangestu co-chaired, come up with anything to counter these individual?
Well, it did. It really did. It's quite a significant document, really. The basis of it was thinking through, what the impact of a whole lot of deals like this with the United States would be, and then what the impact would be if that got out of hand, particularly the pressure on the United States to add discriminatory clauses against China, which is a major supplier of inputs into Southeast Asian manufacturing in those deals, as well as, what could the Southeast Asians do about it? And when you do the numbers on that, it's pretty interesting. First of all, the initial impact of the bilateral deals with the United States is not good, but it's kind of manageable. It has a hit of about 2.3% Southeast Asian incomes and a bit higher to employment because they're labor abundant countries. So, yeah. But if that gets out of hand, there's kind of a contagion process gets underway, then it's very different. There's a huge hit to Southeast Asia, a bigger hit to Southeast Asia than anywhere in the world. You have a drop of income of about 12%, close to 12%, 11 point something percent, and a drop to employment of something like 25%. So that's a big shock, not only politically, and it's a big shock economically, but it's also a big shock politically to Southeast Asia. So how do you do anything about that? That was the question they were posed with. And the Geoeconomic Task Force looked at what you could do by accelerating the process of implementing the mega regional agreement they're involved in, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes China, incidentally, and Australia and New Zealand and so on.
And Japan and South Korea.
Of course, yeah. And the conclusion, of course, to that analysis is that if you do that, you accelerate that, even just you implement what you've already agreed to more quickly on that, you can offset the costs of American tariffs, even the 11% cost of contagion for the region. And so that was the analytic work that they brought to the task. And so they came up with a fair few important conclusions, I think, the task force. The first one was, don't get involved in the retaliation process with the United States. Big countries can get away with that, perhaps. China might get away with it. And we're looking at the cusp of a deal between the United States and China on that, of course, in APEC this week in Korea. But as for middle powers and smaller powers, that's not a game to play. What you do is shoot yourself in the foot if you get into that game. So they recommended strongly against that. And the Southeast Asians have been a masterclass on that, really. They haven't gone for the retaliation game. We didn't either, of course, very sensibly. The second thing they recommended was you accelerate the implementation of go all out on RCEP and convene a leaders meeting of RCEP to get that process moving so that there'd be discipline on the ministers and officials to actually get the thing implemented.
But then, Peter, of course, what that does is it accelerates the integration of these economies with China, which is presumably the opposite of what the United States is demanding and wanting.
It does that to some extent. It stabilizes that, because a lot of the integration with China, of course, it favors the transfer of Chinese industries to Southeast Asia as they search for markets not directly out of China. So on average, I think it's about 40% of inputs into exports from Southeast Asia to the North American market are Chinese inputs. So that sort of integration is there, and the transfer of investment from China to Southeast Asia will accelerate under the Trump tariffs anyway, and it's stabilizing that they seek in integration within the RCEP framework. But it also involves Korea and Japan, of course, too, and us. And if that all falls apart, there's a big shock to the regional economy. So you can't have the kind of regional economy that we've prospered in over the last 30, 40 years without keeping that system together. And the other thing about the Geoeconomics Task Force and the approach of the RCEP process is the second dimension of it, with economic cooperation with other partners. So what they do in implementation is complemented by an exhortation to increase economic cooperation with outside partners. So, it appeals to the old talk of open regionalism in Southeast Asia, one that doesn't cut off, is inclusive of partners beyond the regional arrangement. And that includes India, for example. So a more proactive approach towards engaging India is one of the elements. Whether that'll happen or not, given where Modi and Trump are at, is to be seen. But certainly the door is open there. And the other element of that was, of course, to reach out more actively towards Europe.
So the goal here is to create a multilateral rules-based system with the United States out of the game. Just saying we can't play. We'll play with the United States as an outsider, not as an insider.
Yeah, well, I think it's the important thing and the important diplomacy of the ASEAN position in Kuala Lumpur, as you saw in the management of Trump and so on, was to keep open to the United States, both through the bilateral negotiations, but also open to engagement in whatever exercises. That's unlikely under Trump, as you know. But it's an important thing to keep open. And yes, the game here has got to, I think it's said now widely in the region, it's got to be to get the 85% together, whatever the 15% is doing. That refers to, US being 15% of world trade and the 85% being the rest of us trying to manage the strategies that Washington's trying to pursue now.
What are the obvious, from your point of view, the obvious barriers to success of this process?
Well, they were on full display in Kuala Lumpur. Basically, a big bilateral power can pick individual players off, small players off, and do deals with them that basically corrupt the underlying framework of the strategy you're trying to pursue. You'd have to say to some extent that's been done in the bilateral deal with Malaysia, perhaps Cambodia even too, oddly enough, ironically enough. But it's still a framework that's in place and has a chance. The reference back to that framework is intense among the other players. So as long as the bilateral dealing can be more limited to dealing with the United States, then there's a chance of that strategy succeeding. And, most of the trade still beyond that of the United States is done within WTO frameworks. Most of it's done within WTO frameworks. So, we're still in the game, I'd say. And that's a fairly important strategy to pursue. Now, we're in Australia in a peculiarly complicated position in the management of this game. We have deep multilateral interests. All our trade is concentrated heavily in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, bigger time than anyone else in the OECD, and Southeast Asia. And yet we have this deep interoperability of security arrangements with the United States. And so we have to manage that. And I think our government has been fairly strong on the non-retaliation approach, the approach essentially that's embedded in the ASEAN Geo-Economic Task Force report, and sticking to its last on the multilateral strategy. But also, of course, we've now entered into arrangements with the United States, which will help to insulate against the threat of economic coercion in US negotiations with China over critical minerals. We've been anyway increasing our defense expenditure and consistently with Washington's wish over the last several years, and that's being upped through this AUKUS process that we're committed to with the United States. So managing this economically and geopolitically is not easy for any middle player, including one with as many degrees of freedom as Australia might have, and deep interest in this as we might have. And the critical thing is to make sure it doesn't spread. And we've been pretty careful in the management now of the diplomacy with China since we fixed the trade problem to build up a strategy which continues to accommodate large interdependence, economic interdependence with China, including on forward-looking things like the management of climate change, at the same time as steady the relationship with the United States on the political security side.
But I can imagine the United States pressuring, if not Australia, certainly Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, to not welcome as much Chinese investment, to not get tied up in supply chain networks with Chinese components. And if these small players don't comply, to Trump just slap on higher tariffs, despite what was negotiated yesterday.
Yes, well, and that there certainly will be pressures there. Just how far those pressures will be taken is a question, because it seems the major players in that game have negotiated deals which have resisted that thus far. The Southeast Asians are not shy about dealing with the transshipment issue. The transshipment issue is different from the Chinese integration issue more broadly. The transshipment issue has to do with transshipping Chinese goods through Southeast Asian ports, putting Southeast Asian labels on them and getting into the US market. And getting all that sorted out is a high priority for the Southeast Asians and satisfies an American demand, right? A sensible American demand. But the integration issue is a different one altogether. It's life and blood to the Southeast Asian economy, because the integration with China in that respect delivers new technologies. It does deliver big benefits from new technologies and investment, and it's management largely of private investment now that's a critical interest in that regard, and making it work to the benefit of Southeast Asian economies. For example, in the development of electric vehicle production hubs there, alongside the established combustion engine vehicle production hubs there. So the ASEANs are not going to easily back away from that. They're not. Collectively, they have more voice than they do individually. And so what the Geo-Economic Task Force has done on these international strategies is one thing, but another thing that it's done is press and achieve the integration of ASEAN consultation mechanisms in dealing with this kind of pressure. For example, the economic pillars and the political security pillars in ASEAN used to meet separately and do things differently and so on. And they were more susceptible to being picked off in their own games because of that. Now they've, in consequence of this report and recommendation, they've held their first joint pillar meeting in Kuala Lumpur last week. And that's the beginning of a coordinated strategy on what they call comprehensive regional security. And that includes the economic dimension of that and the management of the economic dimension of that with the United States. So, it sounds easy for Mr. Trump to pick people off here. It sounded easy for him to pick the Chinese off. But it's not quite as easy as he thinks. There is a deep consequence of economic interdependence, which is both positive and negative. Of course, the security people always see the negative side, the vulnerabilities. But the positive side is the mutuality of vulnerabilities and the extent to which that must restrain behavior in respect of hostility and conflict. And, you take the Australia-China case, we supply 54% of all inputs into the Chinese steel industry. Do you think that means that China's going to walk away from the relationship with Australia quickly or rapidly? Can't do it quickly or rapidly. Can't do it for about 2 decades or so, at the very least. It's a big mutual interdependence. So that's the core of it when it comes to the crunch. When we talk about deep economic complementarity, we're talking about a kind of grand bargain of political stability in return for economic stability, or political security in return for economic security. That's what's involved in all our Northeast Asian relationships, including those with China, Japan, and Korea.
So you have a cautious optimism that the countries of RCEP will be able to manage.
Well, I don't know if it's optimism, but at least there's a kind of strategy that's emerging there that's more proactive than it's been for quite a while, because it was quite remarkable to see the Southeast Asians mobilize around the challenge, the threat that the Liberation Day tariffs posed to them. When they sort of did the numbers and thought about it, they got together fairly quickly. I mean, I think I said earlier, it was a bit of a masterclass in response when you consider how Southeast Asia in particular, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. You know what the fragilities of the place are, Dick. But it does have a kind of resilience when the leaders sort of get together. There is an investment in that association, which is critically important at important times. And when the crunch came, I was in Jakarta at the time. Prabowo got on the plane and flew up to Kuala Lumpur, and basically Anwar and Prabowo said, "We're on, basically on this. We're doing this. We're doing it this way." Now, Prabowo is all over the place on other things. we don't know, but when a process like this gets started, then it helps. I mean, I wouldn't put all my money on it, but it helps.
I was living in Malaysia when ASEAN was created back in 1967. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Perak, and I do understand some of the fragilities and some of the pride, and how the creation of ASEAN over the decades has led to personal friendships and relationships between the leaders.
Yes, it's amazing how they've persisted. And you to take the leaders of ASEAN today, Prabowo, Anwar, and Marcos, they all go back. Yeah. They go back a long way. And they can get on the phone and fly to each other and talk about these things. Now, who inspires their talking is another question. But in this case, I think they have drawn on advice, sound analytic advice. Mari was there, in a special role for Prabowo. The deputy minister in Malaysia, Chin Tong, I don't know if you know him. He was the co-chair. He was the chair of that geo-economic task force. Excellent leadership there. And it's happened in a way that, Tokyo, Canberra and so on wouldn't have predicted, frankly. But it's happened. Yeah. And Tokyo, Canberra and Seoul have joined in the process when it came to the crunch on the RCEP leaders meeting.
Well, so Mr. Trump might be a blessing in disguise.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd quite characterize. He could have done it another way.
Well,
now, of course, the big thing now is in APEC. After Trump's visit to Japan, and there every focus will be on Trump's conversation with Xi and how that manages the US-China deal. Whether we can back away from the extremes in that. And it looks like there are some elements of that out in public now. One element, of course, is that the Chinese will back away from the rare earth export controls, at least for a year or some period, that provide some reliability in the market, and that Trump will back away on the extreme tariffs. China will also start importing soybeans again, and that'll help farmers in the US. And there will be other elements too. But, the makings of a deal seem to be there. That will stabilize things a bit, but it doesn't change the fundamental situation that we have to face and the ways in which we have to work around a world that's very different from the world that we've enjoyed over the last 30 or 40 years, basically. On track.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense for the Chinese and the Americans to make those reasonable compromises. The wild card, of course, is that Trump gets mercurially upset about something 3 weeks from now or 2 weeks from now and flips a switch again. Mm. But the fact that the Chinese have put in place this licensing concept or this framework tells the world what they could do if they want to do it at a cost to themselves, but at a much bigger cost to other players. And I don't think I would have said this before, but that's a good thing.
You wouldn't have. Well, it's
a stabilizing. It's potentially a stabilizing
thing. Now, if the Chinese are wise, of course, they will understand that that's a short-term asset in the exercise of coercive power, if you like. It's not a long-term asset, and the moves with us and the United States, even though they're not going to deliver short-term effective responses to that either. They'll deliver medium, long-term responses to it. Basically frame that, and so basically putting these things in place stabilizes the negotiations a bit, and I think in that sense your observation is completely justified.
Well, listen, Peter, this has been a delight to have a conversation with you, and I'm pleased that there is some optimistic view of things of cooperation among the leaders of ASEAN and more broadly RCEP. And
well, it's great to talk to you too, Dick. And I think I'm trying to think of what the better word for optimism is. So I think at least it's good to see some practical, possibly workable solutions to some of the problems that we face in the region being worked through and talked through, and that's a thing to be encouraged and participate in. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation.
Thank you, Peter. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hosted by Dick Drobnik, the Asia Pacific Business Forum podcast is produced by Dan Griffin of GG Films.